Leadsom.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I've just got a couple of questions. I mean, first of all, I think George Osborne is exactly right that now is not the moment to be doing this. So I'd like to know what's your very clear thought on if we were to enact primary legislation now, it would clearly be, chances are, the autumn before you actually got into work, by which time a general election is very clearly underway with all of the kind of fluff and so on that entails. Is this a sensible idea in your personal opinion?
Well, I think in terms of the legislation, what you couldn't do is wait until the autumn until you knew what we were supposed to be doing, and at that stage put in place the resources and the people and the processes to do that. If you had a good idea of what the legislation was going to say and an informal but fairly public understanding that everybody was agreed on what those rules of the game were going to be, and for example the Treasury was willing to allow us to go out and start to recruit people in readiness for that, then obviously you could make that a parallel process, cutting some of the necessary time rather than one in which you have a long debate over the legislation. You do that, yes, and then you start.
But
so
I'm asking you for your personal opinion, bearing in mind how the pressure mounts in the run-up to a general election. Is it a good time to be doing it when there is so much pressure and so many hot-headed people running around right now, or would it be better to think about it again after the next general election? Your personal opinion, not the doability, but how sensible it would be to be doing this for the first time when we're already into general election mode.
Well, I think the point is that whenever you do it in an election period, people are always going to be anxious. Also, having gone through this at the IFS for the last two, you always prepare and you know the difficulties that are coming up with. So I think whenever you did it for the first time, it would be difficult and challenging. And in that sense, I don't think people are going to be more anxious and jumping about this election than they will be the next one necessarily. Who knows? I think there's a slightly different question on, has the OBR established its credibility with the tasks it's been given enough at the moment for people to be confident that if you put us into that sort of environment and the political waters were choppy, would that undermine the credibility of a relatively young, relatively untested organisation? Now that's obviously, it has to be for the eye of the beholder and not for me to say whether we're ready to fulfil that task.
No, but is it a concern of yours? Is it, in terms of 1 to 10, is it a high 10 concern of yours or a 1 you're not really bothered?
Well, as I say, my main concern is whether there could be sufficient agreement on the rules of the game and the nature of the job in time for us still to be able to put the resources in place to do this properly. I'm not, clearly it's always, whenever you do it, it's going to be difficult, it's going to be challenging, it's always challenging over these sorts of election periods in these sorts of roles, and it will be whenever we do that for the first time. So I don't shy away from that if Parliament wants us to do that. My greater concern is, can you actually get everybody to agree on what it is you want us to do, and equally importantly on what you don't want us to do in time to get the mechanics in place.
So final question, you're more than likely to only have a year at most if you do get the go-ahead. Would you be concerned that you might be treated in some way as a kind of consultant to political parties to, well, if that doesn't look attractive, how could we do it so that it did look attractive? Would you be worried about falling into that trap? And is that, bearing in mind the time pressure you'd be under, I mean, do you have a personal concern about that?
I think that is a potential issue, because I think in order to be even-handed between the way in which we deal with government policies that come towards us and that we would deal with policies of individual parties, I think you do need to have some capacity in the process for a bit of toing and froing. They come to you with a policy, you say, we've looked at this, we've looked at the analysis, we think these are the following effects. The party looks at this and says, crikey, that's not at all what I was expecting, I think we need to rethink this. That happened time after time at the IFS when we were dealing with opposition parties doing that. So there has to be some sort of limit to how much toing and froing you're willing to do, and I think that would make it very important to set out deadlines and to manage the process quite well to ensure you didn't get into too much difficulty there. I think it would be quite hard to write down hard and fast rules saying we can have 3 toing and froing things and then 3 strikes and you're out, or something like that. You could imagine thinking of those sorts of rules.
But without that,
they might be quite hard to apply.
But without that, you run the risk of being seen as politically biased, don't you? Of being accused of being politically biased. If you're seen to be working with one party on their tax policy and not another, then you do run that risk, which must be a concern.
Well, you would run that risk, but I guess no more than as we look at the current government policies. If the government doesn't decide to do something, partly because of what we would say about the consequence of it, and they decide not to do it, does that make us politically biased, or is that, that's part of the process that we're there to do? And at the end of the day, it's for the politicians, it's for the minister in this case, for politicians generally to decide after we've said what we think the costing of a particular policy is, whether they want to proceed with it or not. Because I think, as with the current process, the key point is that I'm not envisaging that this would operate in such a way as a party comes to us with a set of publicly announced policy positions on which we then make a public pronouncement that's potentially, surprising to them and says that this is going to raise a third of what they think, or cost twice as much, etc. We'll be having a confidential discussion, as we do with ministers now, and at the end of the day, the party in this case will know what we would say if they went ahead with this, and it is then ultimately for them to decide whether to go ahead with it or not.